Madeline Robbins, and I'm our production manager here at Cherry Bekaert. We have an excellent session planned for you today, and if you were able to catch part one of this session, that was a couple months ago, it does look like we have an impressive group of people joining, and some of you are coming back for part two here. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention a couple things to everybody regarding CPE. You must answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. Those CPE certificates will be issued within 10 days. If you have not received yours after 10 days, you can email cbhlearning@cbh.com. We will also post a recorded version of the webinar in about a week. It'll be sent to you via email and added to our website. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, type those in that Q&A window down at the bottom. Our speakers will be monitoring it today and answering as many questions throughout. And of course, if we don't have time to get to all of them, they'll follow up later. Just a reminder, a short survey will be posted at the conclusion of the webinar. We value your feedback and just hope that you take part. So today I'm happy to introduce our speakers, Scott Anderson and Danny Martinez. Please, Scott, go ahead, take it away.
Great, thank you, Maddie, and thank you for everybody who has joined us after a really long weekend. We are excited to continue speaking with you about SBITAs. Just by way of introduction, my name is Scott Anderson, and I've been with Cherry Bekaert for about 18 years, and started in our Raleigh practice, moved to Tampa, Florida, spent a couple of years at the GASB, and was happy to come back. For those who, someone just asked, how do we get access to part one? It is on YouTube. We've had a lot of people reach out to us from that video. We're very happy to be available to help you with any of your SBITA implementation needs. And I'll turn it over to Danny.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us after the 3-day weekend, like Scott said. For those of you all who do not know me, my name is Danny Martinez. I'm the Government and Public Sector Accounting Advisory Lead for Cherry Bekaert. If you're new to hearing about that group, we do really 4 core things. 1, implementation of new accounting standards. So whether it be GASB 87, GASB 96, we help governments implement new accounting standards. The next thing that we do is draft ACFRs or financial statements for entities that do not want to do that themselves. We have this thing called a surge team, where if governments are behind on their accounting or financial reporting, we come in and kind of surge and bring a lot of governmental accounting expertise to help get governments back on track. And lastly, we have a GASB on demand as a service offering where we are there with you throughout the year to provide any type of GASB support or expertise that you need. Thank you so much for joining today. We have a packed agenda as we always do on these webinars. And so for the next hour, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at the top 10 most important challenges that we've seen in our GASB 96 implementation projects. We have dozens of projects at this time, mostly with 630s, but you all that are 930s that are listening, now is about the time that you all should be starting to sign up for these type of implementation services. And we're going to be going through all of the questions that we usually get asked whenever we're working through this implementation projects. Scott and I have done this quite a few times, and usually by the 10 or 15 seconds in, when one of our clients starts to ask those questions, we know, oh, this topic is what they're asking. Oh, this one is what they're asking about. And really 95% of the questions that we're getting are going to fall into these 10 most important challenges that we're going to be covering today. So hopefully from this, we will have provided you all with solutions to these challenges and really giving you this firsthand account where we can of governments that have gone before you all, so you know what to be looking for as you implement. So what we're not doing today, we're not doing the standard, this is what GASB 96 is webinar, where we're talking about, well, the definition of a SBITA is, and breaking down the definition. We do that, and you can see here there's a QR code if you'd like to access that previous webinar recording that we did in February. Like Scott said, we've received a lot of great feedback from that one. So if you're looking for that, or for the discussion of how we go about the 4 phases of implementation, highly recommend that you scan this QR code here, or you can just Google Cherry Bekaert GASB 96 YouTube, and it'll take you to that link. Scott, last time I checked, I think it was 1,650 or so views or something on that, which to us, which is accountants, that is like finale of Succession type numbers. I mean, these are big numbers for us in terms of people viewing that. So hopefully you all find that webinar helpful. And this part 2 will be a second added layer that will then give you, additional tools as you go about your implementation. I do also want to point out that customized trainings are available where myself, Scott, or our team will provide trainings very specific to what your organization needs and the challenges that you're facing. I just did one with a university on Friday, but we do those as well.
We're basically SBITA influencers, right? That's what we're doing.
We are very close to getting a nickel from YouTube for our services. So we wanted to do this a little bit, make a little bit of fun out of this, right? So Scott and I have been presenting on SBITAs probably since last fall, and we thought, what would be the best way to go about these top 10 challenges in a way that keeps you all interested? And what we came up with was a fantasy draft. So, we were talking to Maddie and Ashley in marketing, and they're like, wait, you guys really did draft these challenges? And we sadly admitted that is the level of nerdiness that we are at. And so, yes, we did draft the top 10 challenges from least important to most important as we viewed them. So in this training, we're going to work backwards from the 10th most important challenge to the most important challenge as we view them. Again, for your organization, it may be different, but this was just our view. And so the factors that we used for this most important draft assessment were 4 factors. Impact to materiality. How, what type of material impact would this challenge have on your financial statement? Impact to your financial statement presentation and disclosure. Impact on a successful implementation, meaning you really need to get this right to have a smooth implementation process. And if we're being honest with each other, our mood on draft day. So we drafted last week, just text back and forth. Scott was at the GFOA conference, halfway getting his CPE and listening to whatever, halfway going through and drafting SBITA challenges with me. So these were the 4 factors that we utilized to kind of determine the top 10 challenges.
I was in the Pacific time zone, so my mood of the day was 7 a.m. in the morning, so that might have impacted it.
Yep, and the last thing to point out is that I graciously gave Scott the #1 pick since he is from North Carolina, and so Charlotte drafted a top 10 a 5'10" quarterback. Let's see what Scott did drafted with his #1 pick. So let's go ahead and go into the first polling question before we get going on the top 10 challenges. So which best describes where you are in the GASB 96 implementation process? A, haven't started. B, searching for SBITA contracts. C, evaluating SBITAs for GASB 96 applicability. D, inputting SBITA information into software. E, done. And I don't know why I said Charlotte, Carolina Panthers. I was thinking Charlotte, you're in Raleigh.
I know we have a few of our GASB friends who signed up. If you're listening, you have to say you have not started implementing.
Yeah, don't skew the results. That's another good point, a good time to point out the Q&As. We will be answering Q&As as we go through. So just submit them when you have them. We leave these polling questions up for 45 seconds to a minute so you all can get your CPE. We're also going to be using this same time to be able to make sure that you that we answer some questions, because sometimes from the back end we run out of time. That being said, we will respond to them after the webinar should we run out of time. All right, so we got the polling results. I'll bring them over here. It looks like 40% are evaluating the SBITAs, 23% are searching for SBITA contracts, and 19% haven't started. Perfect. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get going on the top 10. So again, this is from least impactful to most impactful. However, all of these may be more or less impactful for each organization. And I'll go ahead and go first. So I didn't really get to pick this one. This kind of just fell out as the last of the top 10. But it is, what if we prepaid our SBITA? So we get this question a lot. They say, hey, I'm trying to implement GASB 96, but we've already made all of our payments before, and now we just have this subscription for 3 or 5 years, but there's no payments. So what do I do? And people kind of get themselves in a bind of like, I need to do something for this. What do I put on here for the accounting? And so we want to point you to is, what is a subscription liability? First, so subscription liability should be measured at the present value of all future payments. So if you do not have future payments, you do not have a subscription liability. So let's let that set for a second. But then when you go to GASB 96 and you look at how do I measure a subscription asset, there's 3 components to a subscription asset. It's one, the value of the subscription liability, but then there's 2 other things. There's the payments that you made prior to commencement, and there is the capitalizable implementation costs. So those payments that you made for the subscription asset and any initial capitalization implementation costs that are capitalizable, those would be recorded as your subscription asset. So in these cases, you will still have a subscription asset that you will amortize over the shorter of the life of the subscription, or the useful life of the IT software, but you will not have a subscription liability. And so you'll want to make sure that you're keeping track of it for that side of the accounting. Scott, anything to add there? Do you want me to go to number 9?
Well, I would like to point out that there currently isn't any implementation guide specifically for SBITAs. One will come out soon. But in the meantime, there are lots of implementation guide Q&As on leases, which can readily be analogized to your SBITA questions. And so there was one in the 2021 implementation guide update, question 4.9, that I think addresses this pretty well. In that question, the question that's being asked is whether or not you have to recognize interest expense when you've prepaid your lease. And the answer is no, you wouldn't, because you don't have a liability if you've prepaid it. You would continue to have the asset. So the lease asset is tied to the liability only in measurement, but they're independent otherwise. So you would still have that asset even though the liability has already been paid off.
Perfect.
All right, and number 9, there's our delay for effect, implementation of SBITA that crosses the fiscal year. Now, the reason why I made this, one of my later picks, was because this really isn't a first-year problem. This is a problem or a challenge that you may face going forward, perhaps not an implementation year where you're going to have a lot of SBITAs that are already in place that you're working with, as opposed to one that maybe is new that you're still implementing when you first implement GASB 96. So there are really 2 questions that I think summarize this challenge the best. What do we do with implementation costs that have been incurred as of fiscal year end? And then what does or when does the commencement of the term begin? So if you'll remember, regarding implementation costs, there are 3 stages of implementation, very similar to the stages of implementation for internally developed software or purchase software in GASB 51. You have the preliminary project stage, which is a stage where you're just trying to decide what kind of software you want, what kind of vendor you're going to use. Any costs associated with that would be in that preliminary project stage. But for this challenge, we're really talking about stage 2, which is the initial implementation stage. And that's the stage where you're incurring all the charges necessary to place the subscription asset into service. Generally, you're going to capitalize those costs and include them in your subscription asset. The third stage, of course, operation and additional implementation stage, where you're of course not going to capitalize the operation stage, but then the additional implementation as you are continuing to implement new modules that improve the efficiency and the functionality of the SBITA, those would also get capitalized. But what do you do when your fiscal year ends and you're in the middle of implementing a new SBITA? We had this question before. We've had it many times, and a lot of folks are capitalizing those costs already into CIP, but the GASB 96 paragraph 26 specifically says that you are going to record those as a prepayment, even though the CIP and a prepayment essentially does the same thing. You're not depreciating the CIP. It's still an asset. GASB 96 provides that you put it in prepaid in order to be consistent with 87. There is a question in the exposure draft to the implementation guide. I believe this question is going to remain in the new one that will be issued in a couple of weeks, that addresses the part about when does the commencement term begins. And in this example, there's a 6-year contract, but it takes about 2 years for the implementation phase to be complete. And therefore the term ends up being 4 years. So your lease or your SBITA term does not begin until that initial implementation stage is complete, which is the first module is placed into service.
All right, perfect. Going to number 8. Most of our SBITAs are small dollar amounts. So this is talking about materiality, capitalization thresholds. Where do I draw the line? Because SBITAs, unlike SBITAs comparatively, leases are a lot more in the lower dollar amount range. So you're trying to determine the cost and benefit of and where the line you're going to draw in terms of capitalization. And so each government is going to want to utilize a capitalization threshold that takes into account balances both individually and in the aggregate. And so what you're going to want to be doing is get that full population, get all of my subscriptions, and that way you can get a better understanding of where you want to draw the line. And you're going to want to be thinking about it from 2 angles. You're going to want to be looking at the subscription asset. What would be a good capitalization threshold for my subscription asset? And then also what would be a good threshold for my subscription liability? A lot of governments tend to have larger dollar amounts on the asset side than they do on the liability side. So you want to keep in mind that you're also putting a subscription liability on the books and that you need to factor in those independently. Down here at the bottom in the purple, you can see the guidance that is provided in every single pronouncement about the provisions of the statement need not be applied to immaterial items. And so GASB puts that in all of their statements, just to remind people that you should be thinking about the line that you're going to draw within your organization and not apply it to immaterial items and really outweigh when you're talking about cost and benefit. So you say, okay, great. Yeah, that's all good in practice, but just give me a number. So GASB is not going to give you a number. Let's just tell you what is happening in practice from what we're seeing. The most common threshold that we're seeing utilized is the capital asset capitalization threshold. I will tell you probably 75–80% of the governments that we work with are just taking whatever the threshold they use for capital assets, or maybe the threshold that they use for leases, whether it be the same or different, and they're just applying that to their subscription-based IT arrangements. Other things that you can think about and consider is just keep in mind what this SBITA is. So this SBITA is an intangible capital asset. And so if you have other intangible capital assets on your books that maybe have a different threshold, think about, is that threshold something that you'd like to utilize for your SBITAs? The last thing I'd like to point out is that many governments have very low capitalization thresholds for their capital assets because of other things other than how it's going to look in terms of the dollar amount on their financial statement. And so, worried about, the computers going away or keeping track of the inventory for vehicles. These types of risks aren't necessarily there with subscription-based IT arrangements. So there could be the argument that because those risks aren't there, that you're going to raise the materiality level to say 5x or 10x of what you have for your other types of capital assets. I will tell you that in working with some of the larger governments, it is not rare to see some of them going into the six figures, say like the $100,000 range for their capitalization threshold, and they're working with their auditor and with their full population to define why they feel that, say, $100,000 threshold is okay for the subscription-based IT arrangements. You'll want to do the work up front in terms of evaluating the full population. You'll, of course, want to work with your auditor because they are the ones that are going to be opining on your financial statements. But those are things to think about in terms of capitalization and thresholds that you should be utilizing. All right, Scott, turn it back over to you for number 7.
And just to add on to what you just said, there are a few implementation guide updates as well. For that one, in 2021, there's one that modifies it for, generally speaking, a capitalization threshold and the importance of assessing in the aggregate. So you may have a threshold high enough that you're sweeping a lot of things under the rug, but you've got to look at all those things in aggregate to decide if it's material. And then one in the 2019-3 implementation guide update that specifically talks about lease liability. Your threshold is usually applied to an asset, but whether or not that should be applied to your liability as well. Just refrain, I would emphasize, just refrain from deciding or determining that the effect on net position is the only materiality determination, because you are going to have an asset and a liability, and they will offset each other at the net position level. But that's not necessarily what's always important to users.
I guess I'll wrap with one last thing. So when we work with our advisory clients and they want to use a number that's different, we ask them, have you looked at your full population? And if you exclude everything under that number, what is that going to do? And do you all feel comfortable with the amount that it's going to exclude from your assets and your liabilities? And is your auditor comfortable with the approach that you're taking? So you that's definitely something that you want to have that full population first, and then you want to start having those discussions up front as you're determining the threshold you're going to use. I kind of teased number 7. I'll go ahead and let it go here. Here's number 7, Scott.
All right, so number 7 is, what are we paying for in these contracts? 2 things I want to bring up here, and we're going to catch up on some time a little bit. If you want to skip to the next slide, Danny. First, please remember the definition of a SBITA. I'm sure at this point everyone has it memorized, but I will say that every piece of that definition was very intentional. It comes from the 87 definition, right? We took that definition and they just swapped out non-financial assets with IT software. But I imagine that it started off as a much simpler definition, and as the deliberative process happened, more pieces got added on intentionally in order to really capture what it is the board is trying to get you to report. So remember, it's a contract that conveys control of the right to use another person's IT software as specified in the contract for a period of time in an exchange or exchange-like transaction. And a lot of times you're going to have contracts that will have different components. Some of those components will meet that definition and some of them will not. A contract might have a hardware component, might have software, might have service component, might have software that's a perpetual license, and so not a SBITA. So pay attention to that. And then the other thing I will say, as we get going with this challenge, is there is a lot of opportunity here to overcomplicate this. You may have something that's both hardware and software and want to really overthink how this goes. So remember, the SBITA definition includes IT software alone or in combination with tangible capital assets. At the same time, it scopes out IT software that is combined with tangible capital assets that meet the definition of a lease in which the software component is insignificant. So I look at that and I think you can't have 2 components that are significant. You can't have 2 that's insignificant. One's going to be significant, one is not, is going to be insignificant. So the example that it uses in the guidance is a smart copier. Smart copier obviously is going to have an advanced software component, but what is it exactly that you're purchasing? What is it that you're doing? You want the copier. You can't really use the bells and whistles without the copier. And so don't overcomplicate this part of it. Next slide. Another suggestion when it comes to this is to get your IT department involved. And we probably say that a lot, but your IT department can be an excellent resource when it comes to implementing this guidance. They're going to know more intuitively and more practically what is a service maintenance agreement, for example, or what part of a contract is for service. You may also want to reach out to the vendor. Vendor can provide some pretty good information to you on when you are breaking out the service component, for example, from the SBITA, how much the service component would cost, even though it might not be explicit in your contract. And then just because you access something online doesn't mean it is a SBITA. Sometimes the subscription is merely for content. Remember that first part of the definition is it's control of the right to use another person's IT software. And so you may only have access to an interface, which would not necessarily meet this definition. So just remember that part as a caution as you try to implement this guidance.
And what we're seeing here is IT contracts do lend themselves to bundling. So there's a lot of these where you're going to see all of the different components mixed in, not just a SBITA component. And in terms of the accessing online, for those of you all that are higher ed or K through 12 that are listening, really take a look at your agreements for your online textbooks and what you're paying for. If you're just paying for the content, the book itself, versus if you're paying for a learning management software that has a lot of bells and whistles, interactivity. And so you're going to want to be looking at what you're specifically paying for. And just because you're accessing it through a computer, it doesn't mean it's a SBITA. So that's one with K through 12 higher ed that we spend a lot of time looking at and reading through and helping to scope out some of those things that are, those online textbook based contracts.
There's a lot of professional judgment that should be documented as you go through this implementation process.
Definitely. Moving right along, we're doing pretty well on time. So number 6, subscription amount is based solely on user licenses versus tiered pricing. So you're getting into your contracts, you're reading through them, and you're seeing that some of these payments are user licenses, but then some you have these tiers like 0 to 500, 501 to 1,000 users. And then you go to the calculation of subscription liability, and you see this little tweak from GASB 87 where it says that variable payments based on future performance of a government or number of user seats, and then put that in bold to emphasize, should not be included in the measurement of the subscription liability. And so you see these and you think, well, there's numbers in here in terms of tiers, so that must be user seats, so I just consider everything variable. And so we want to make sure that we caution you that it's not necessarily that simple. So to point out a few things. First, variable subscription IT arrangement payments are still recognized in the period incurred and do require note disclosure. So don't just think you can completely get rid of them, right? There's still note disclosure that goes along with those. And if you're thinking about, is it solely based on the number of user seats, what you want to do is go to extreme examples. So in this case, I say, if you were going to use 0 seats for the year, what would you be paying for the subscription? So you sign up and you're utilizing, you're turning on or off seats. What would you be paying for if you just didn't turn any of them on? And that'll kind of help you to figure out if you really do have something that's based on the number of user seats, or if you have something that's more like a minimum payment. So examples here, agreement is 100% based on number of user seats, then you don't have that subscription liability. So here we say $75 per user per month, turn it on, turn it off, your payment goes up and down by that $75. That you can see how it would lend itself to being variable. Here's another example, and one that we see quite often, is that you have an agreement that is a fixed price up to a number of user seats. So you have this tiered pricing, and you're paying that amount no matter how many of them are active. And so when we meet with our advisory clients, they say in this example, you can see here, we're at price level B. We're for 2,400 to 5,999 seats. You said it's user seats, so we're just going to say it's variable. Well, we asked them, if you were to use none of those, or if you use any range between the 2,400 and 5,999, what would you be paying? And oftentimes you find that there's a fixed payment amount there that you're agreeing to based off of the tier or level that you're in. And so in that case, the payment is in essence fixed in substance. And so that would be something that would be factored in to your subscription liability. So take it to those extreme examples and thinking about how many of these would I use? And then based off of that, you can figure out, do you really have something that's fixed that would lend itself to be a subscription liability or not? And this comes up quite often, so make sure that you're looking at those. All right, let's go to polling question number 2. We are halfway through the top 10. Which of these challenges do you anticipate causing your government the most difficulty? So the first 5 that we went through, the prepaid SBITA, implementation crossing fiscal years, the materiality determination, the bundling, or user licenses versus tiered pricing. Which of these do you anticipate giving your government the most difficulty? And so I see a question that you can go ahead and ask, and asking about, I thought initial implementation, you don't have to go back and pick up costs paid before the current year. GASB allows you the option prior to your implementation date to not go back and grab those initial implementation costs. So you had initial implementation costs prior to the commencement date of GASB 96. You can choose whether or not you're going to go back. That's different than your prepayments, which hopefully are already reported as an asset because you paid for something that you're utilizing over multiple years. And so there's 2 pieces in there. Those initial implementation, you have the option of going back or not, but the prepayments, hopefully you have them as an asset somewhere if you hadn't utilized it all through the year.
In our initial conversations, we have heard some governments say that they have always been accumulating these costs as CIP in accordance with 51, even though 51 was not related to these specific arrangements.
Thank you, Scott. So it looks like the number 1 was don't know what we're paying for, which is common. Really, anything related to reading these contracts is just, people are realizing it's a pretty big challenge. So that came in first at 36%. Turn it back over to Scott for number 5.
All right, we need a drum roll when we do these things. All right, so state contracts and piggybacking. Please, in your reactions, give me a round of applause if this is something you've already seen. We've got a lot of questions on this over the last couple of months, and it's okay. So there's a couple of people. Oh, a lot more applause as people are finding the reactions button. So people are. This question has been asked, I think, as early as December for me, and I will be the first to admit that I was wrong. My first response to this question was wrong because in my mind, the definition begins with a contract, and if a government does not have a specific contract with the vendor, I didn't think it would fall within the scope. Now, just so we are all clear on what we're talking about here, we're talking about a state agency or some state government entering into a contract with a vendor, and then other state agencies or lower levels of government are able to take that contract and obtain access to the right to use from that vendor. And so this, it turns out, happens quite a bit. And as we kept getting this question, I decided I needed to hear how the GASB was answering this question. And so I did reach out and we did consult. And so the way you should really be thinking about this is that a contract is not necessarily something that is written. It can be verbal. The basis for conclusion in 96 doesn't say a lot about this, but GASB 87 does say a little bit about this. A contract consists of an understanding of terms and conditions, rights and obligations. It's only required that it's legally enforceable. And so if the state enters into an agreement with the with the vendor, the local government can accept those terms and conditions either through, a purchase order or through an invoice, which would document or which would support that them entering or accepting those terms and conditions. So if you, and the example that we saw, by the way, we saw the contract with the state and the vendor had all the terms and conditions specifically laid out. And then there was an invoice between the local government and the vendor, and that invoice specifically referenced that contract. And so that was in fact the local government accepting those terms and conditions. I don't know how material this ends up being, because I haven't seen too many of these or any of these where the invoice or purchase order was for longer than a year. And so you may be piggybacking on the contract, but it may end up being short-term anyway. But just so you know, that is a contract that you should evaluate and include and document your reasoning for why it's just short-term. So this slide summarizes the contract must be legally enforceable. Substance is more important than the label. I will also say that there are some arrangements where the state enters into the contract, the local government uses the software and pays the state rather than the vendor. And in that case, it is not within the scope. You're just reimbursing the state for their costs for their contract. And you would just recognize the flows in and out as that occurs.
I saw a really good example of this last week where, it was a large contract where this, here are the costs that you're going to be paying. But within it was sort of like an order sheet, about a 3-page order sheet for the specific university's portion of this contract. So where they would actually be signing up, so a little bit stronger than an invoice, but where they would be signing up to those larger terms and conditions for a certain period of time. And so I thought that was a really good example of where they were entering into an agreement within this broader purchasing agreement. And so that's what you're going to want to be looking for and reading through. Again, with GASB 96, a lot of professional judgment being utilized here and just documenting where you land, because with all these things, you're going to land at a certain place. And so you just want to document that thought process for your auditors and both to put it in your policy to apply it consistently. Number 4, we're getting down to the most impactful challenges. And so number 4 is this a perpetual license? And so going to the definition of a SBITA, you have that for a period of time in exchange or exchange-like transaction. So if it's a period of time, by definition, that means that it's not perpetual. So we're seeing these agreements that have the 1-year payment and then goes on. And they're saying, hey, is this perpetual? Can I just get out of this? And unfortunately, the answer is it's not that simple. And we'll touch on, kind of a spoiler alert, we'll touch on the automatic renewal a little bit more in a minute, but let's talk specifically about this perpetual license. And does this meet the definition of perpetual? So there's some confusion about perpetual versus subscription. So I want you to keep in mind that perpetual means indefinitely. Typically, these contracts have large upfront costs, and they won't have term options in there. So you're just buying the thing. You're getting the thing for an indefinite amount of time. Within this, you'll usually see that there's some tech support for a limited amount of time. So we will support this product for X number of years. We'll say that the use of perpetual licensing is declining. And so this isn't going to be as common as, say, as it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. So usually those older licenses are the ones that are going to tend to be perpetual. I think this table here on the right does a really good job of helping you determine perpetual versus subscription. I know a few of you all have asked, are you going to get copies to the slides? And yes, you will be receiving a link to access those after the presentation, but this is a good slide to be able to pull out and help you determine which bucket you're in and if you really do have a perpetual license. And so this implementation guide question addresses just that, and we'll touch more specifically about the automatic renewal part, but they're saying, hey, I have an automatic renewal that continues to renew until canceled. Does that mean I have a perpetual license? And so GASB goes through and says, no, the perpetual license is a purchase in which a government is granted a permanent right to use the vendor's computer software. and it talks about what to do with automatic renewals that we'll dig into in a second.
And just a reminder, we're pulling these Q&As from the exposure draft. I think they have made some tweaks to these, so they'll be a little bit different when they come out next month or two.
Thank you, Scott. All right, top three. So bronze medal in our fantasy draft.
All right, we can't find some of our agreements. This is probably relatable to everybody, both at work and at home, where we all have subscriptions and we don't know necessarily what we're paying for. We just see it hit our bank accounts every month. So this is the fun part where you get to take off your accounting hat and you put on your detective hat. And it's fun to go sleuthing around and uncover what's going on when you have lots of time to do it. When you don't have a lot of time to do it, this can be probably pretty aggravating. This step is beyond the step to identify your subscriptions. In a perfect world, your IT department is going to have a complete list of all your IT related subscriptions. And then they're going to have a filing cabinet, digital or otherwise, that has all of the terms or conditions for each of those subscriptions. But this isn't always the case. Even when you've got an IT department devoted to doing this and being organized with this, which I think a lot of them are, a lot of governments are a little bit more decentralized, and it's so easy to enter into a subscription without telling anybody. You just click the button and all of a sudden you've got the subscription. And now where do you go to find the terms and conditions? So, so some tips and tricks on what to do or how you can go about finding those subscriptions. A lot of times, if you just go onto the website, scroll down at the very bottom, it will have a list of all the terms and conditions. You can try canceling it and see what happens, right? It's not going to let you cancel if you're entered into an agreement. You can directly reach out to the software vendor for the terms and conditions. I promise they have them. They're not just gonna keep them from you. And then document steps taken to if you are unable to find the contract to support. If there's no terms and conditions, that means you can cancel it at any time. You really only have a month-to-month arrangement. Just you need to document the process you took for every agreement that you were unable to obtain or find the terms and conditions. Now, Danny, you have a lot more real-world experience with this. Do you have anything to add with that?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So typically we some IT departments will give us a nice subscription list, but then when we're wanting to evaluate the contracts within this list to figure out are they in or outside of 96, they say, well, we don't have anything. We have something that's expired. We pay off of this invoice, and we send them back to IT. IT comes back and says, hey, we don't have anything. We give them ideas for where to search online, to contact the vendor. But think about it on our advisory side. We're trying to help you determine how much you're paying and how long you're on the hook for. And without these agreements, we're really handcuffed in terms of what we can do to assist. The one benefit for working with an advisory firm or firm to help you with this is that we've seen contracts from a lot of these vendors already, right? We were probably in the 1,000, over the 1,000 mark of the number of SBITAs that we've looked at as of this point. And so typically whenever we're trying to determine the scope of our services, we look at your list and we're like, oh, we've seen 40 of these 60. And so sometimes we can provide, obviously not the payment information, but we can show our advisory clients, hey, this is what a subscription from this software vendor looks like. This is the heading. That way they at least know there's one out there rather than going on a wild goose chase. So partnering also with, if you're a school, other schools in your area that have the same vendors, partnering with other municipalities, those types of things where oh, they also use it. Let me see what they have. That would probably be another thing that you could do.
All right, so I think this is me. Polling question number 3. Given the information you have as of today, how many SBITAs would you estimate your government has? And if you don't know, you haven't got to that point, how many do you anticipate, or how many are you evaluating to be part of SBITAs? 0 to 25, 26 to 75, 76 to 150, 151 to 500 plus.
You're missing E.
Oh, well, it's not on the poll. E, not a government, just stock in your presentation. Those would be all of our GASB friends, right? But there's no option on the poll to select it.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, not well. If you're not, maybe you can just abstain. But yeah, that was for our GASB friends or other CPA friends that we know are hanging out. Our software lease software vendor friends too. Wanted to give them a button to answer as well. Next time we'll make sure we get it on the poll that you click. All right, so it looks like, oh, Scott, can you see the results as well?
I can, but
Okay, go
you're
ahead.
take it away. You're good at it. Go ahead.
All right, looks like the leader is 0 to 25 of 40%. Over 10% of you are in the 151 to 500. I will caution the 0 to 25 and 26 to 75 people. Make sure that you feel really good about that number. On average, we're seeing for higher ed and K through 12 about 10 times the number of subscription contracts as leases. For general purpose government, cities, counties, we're seeing about 3 to 4 times as many subscription contracts. Not to say that they all make it to the definition of a SBITA and a subscription liability on your financial statements at the end of the day, but just from that initial list that you're having to comb through, that's about what we're seeing in terms of coverage. So just when you're reaching out to your organizations, and we'll talk about a little bit about how to do that, just keep that in mind, that the volume that we're seeing here in terms of IT subscriptions is quite large.
For those of you over 151, I think this is bragging rights. You don't have to, but put in the chat, what's your number? How many you got?
Biggest number wins a thumbs up from us. All right, so this was my top pick because Scott took the other one. So this was my top pick in terms of most impactful, and it is the automatic renewal dilemma. There's so many contracts that you're going to look at where you have it for a year and then something happens. Either you have the unilateral right to renew, both parties have to renew. You know how much they're going to charge you when you renew in future years. You have no clue what they're going to charge you in the future years. There's really this point on most of the contracts, I'd say 80% of the contracts, where something happens after that 12-month period that you need to make a determination on. And it's not as simple as saying, well, it's 12 months and then I have to renew, so it's a short-term SBITA, I'm done, right? And so that's what we really want to drive home and why I picked it as my top pick. So there's a couple common types of arrangements, really two that we're seeing. One where you have clear payment terms after 1 year, and one where you do not have clear payment terms after 1 year. What you're going to want to be thinking about is what is happening at that automatic renewal point. And so what the implementation guide exposure draft section says is that when a government has an automatic renewal, really what that is a termination option. And so what they're saying is you should include all terms where you are reasonably certain that you're not going to terminate. So just give that a second to sit. So first you want to look at who has the option to automatically renew. Is it just you? Great, then that's where we're at here on this slide. Do both you and the software vendor have to agree to renew? Can you both get out of it at that 1 year period? At that point, it is a cancelable term, which would not be included in your evaluation of your subscription term. So you have one that's both sided. They can, and you'll see the language. It says both parties have to agree. Or there's one where you just click a button, or you don't even do anything, and it just automatically renews for another year, and it's solely up to your discretion. And so what you're doing is, so let's assume we're in that case. You have 1 year. Well, I'm reasonably certain I'm not going to terminate. Okay, let's go to 24 months. Are you still reasonably certain that you're not going to terminate? Let's go to the next one, 36 months. Am I still reasonably certain that I'm not going to terminate? And you keep working out that keep working out until you say, okay, at this time period, I can't say that I'm reasonably certain I'm not going to terminate. That is my subscription term. So how to think about if you're going, like when you are reasonably certain not to terminate. You can see here in this second bullet point, past history. Have you automatically renewed in the past? Payment terms. Are the payment terms clear where you know what you're paying? The example, and I like to give extremes with all of these things. So the example is, say you're in it for a year and you have zero clue what the payment is going to be in the automatic renewal year. If that jumps 100%, would you still automatically renew? Right? If you're unclear about what you're going to be paying in the future, it makes it a little bit harder to say that you're reasonably certain not to terminate. The other thing that you can lean on here with subscription-based IT arrangements is technological advances, right? I mean, ChatGPT, AI, all of these things. How confident are you that you're not going to reasonably terminate from whatever software you have now 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future? You know, who knows what we're going to be using out at that point. And so that's why we're seeing on average, the terms for GASB 96 are shorter than the terms for GASB 87. Another thing that you're going to want to be thinking about here is the upfront costs. If you invested a lot into the software upfront, that also will lend itself to that you're going to continue to utilize it for additional years. This is going to be very subjective, and you're going to want to lean on professional judgment, put it in policy and apply it consistently. There's also the argument of looking at it just by types of software versus every single one, where, oh, my ERP system, I'm reasonably certain based on past history, that's 15 years. Oh, these one-off softwares, I'm reasonably certain for 2 or 3, you know, those types of things. So we work with our clients to think about this and talk through it and put it into policy. That first bullet point in terms of clear terms, that is helpful because you can see for each of these renewals, it's going up 4%. That'll help you with your reasonable certainty determination. The second example is from Salesforce, and what it says is after that 1 year, it will automatically renew at whatever the price is based off of our list pricing at that next year. So how confident are you that you're not going to terminate if you don't even know the price, right? That's something that you want to think about. The other thing that you want to think about is, does a contract need to be signed? What is happening at that period to then extend it? How are those payment terms determined? And that'll help you determine if you have just that 1 year period or if you have a subscription liability that extends.
The other thing to add to that, Danny, is even if you are reasonably certain that you're not going to exercise that termination option because of the cost investment you have in it, if you don't know what the price is for next year, then it's variable. You're not going to include that in your calculation of the liability anyway. So
thank you. Yeah, so it's the reasonable certainty, and then it's also, well, what's my liability? And if it's variable, it's variable, right? So thank you. That's another question that gets asked in a piece of it. All right, number 1, drum roll, please.
All right, drum roll.
I drummed on my desk for you. All right.
Okay.
We are having a hard time. Oh, go ahead. That's you.
Yeah, we're having a hard time explaining to IT and other departments what we're looking for. Is that right? Is that an accurate challenge? Has anybody had that challenge out there? Accountants and IT folk don't always speak the same language, right? So this can be a challenge that perhaps is exasperated a little bit by the fact that GASB 96 uses the term IT software and doesn't provide a definition anywhere, which, by the way, is a good thing. I think the GASB made the right decision in not venturing into the world of IT in their terminology. The term IT software is generally pretty well understood. Adding a specific definition would have just made it, I think, even harder to talk about this with your IT department. One of the things that Danny and I have been doing is we've done some workshops. We went, to Charlotte for an afternoon. We went to Dallas for an afternoon in order to kind of work through some examples and talk through this. And in both cases, IT professionals were there. So some of the governments invited their IT folks to their trainings in order for those IT professionals to get the same explanation as to what it is a SBITA is and how to account for it and what it is we're looking for. And so I think that's important. I think another thing to remember is that for much of the life of the standard, it was referred to as cloud computing arrangements. Cloud computing arrangements is a little bit of a buzzword, and that's why towards the end of the deliberative process, the GASB moved away from that term and adopted subscription-based information technology arrangements as a term that perhaps will continue to cover specifically what this guidance is intended to address. But cloud computing arrangements, I think, is a term that you can use with IT professionals. They understand what that means. The basis for conclusion includes, lists off some types of cloud computing arrangements: software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, data warehousing as a service. In our last workshop in Dallas, someone had asked, well, what is platform as a service? And Danny and I looked at each other. We didn't know, but an IT professional was there and he raised his hand and knew exactly what it was and gave us the definition. So I think including them helps quite a bit. And if you just think of it in terms of cloud computing arrangements, you're going to capture quite a bit of what we're talking about here. Anything to add with that, Danny?
No, just go ahead and go into the solutions.
Oh, that's right. I didn't realize I wasn't there yet. All right. So again, working with your IT department, define in policies and what we're talking about, what a SBITA is, and then applying that consistently. We have worked out internally that we've provided to many folks a SBITA checklist, which can aid in your discussion. It lists off several different types of SBITAs that can be considered. And we had some of our IT folks take a look at it to make sure it made sense to them. We also have a template that was developed. It's a 5-question template that asks, just pointed questions, depending on the answers given, it can help you back into whether or not what you're looking at is a SBITA. And then engage your IT departments early, hold meetings with them and get in the same room. As you get in the same room and you talk through things, the answer from the IT might be, no, we don't have any. But then as you talk about it and really what you're working through and engage them, I think a lot more will pop out.
Two things to point out there: that the potential SBITA checklist, it has the top 32 potential SBITAs. That is something that we provide for free. Just message us and we'll send you a copy after the webinar. Our webinar follow-up team will also ask you if you want a copy of that. And the template, the 5-question template in terms of explaining in plain English to departments, that one is actually part of our advisory services. And it helps you, the departments, do a first cut in terms of the ones that are outside of the scope to help you narrow down where you need to focus your time on those ones you're unsure about, if it meets the definition of a SBITA or not. Pushing right up until the hour. So let me go ahead and say that's the draft. Thank you so much for attending. We have one more polling question, so don't leave because you need it for your CPE. Just keep in mind that a successful implementation takes time. When we work with our governments in our advisory group, it usually takes about 8 to 12 weeks for a successful implementation. So you 930s, if you need assistance, I'd say jump on it now. 630s, there's still time to sign you up and put you in. Make sure that you don't just give this to the person that you just hired. Be like, oh, this person isn't loaded up yet. Let's let them learn GASB 96. Try to have someone that's a little bit more knowledgeable with your organization and where you all have your contracts, how you procure, how to work with IT. Make sure you utilize tools, templates, and software where you can, so you do not recreate the wheel on implementation. You want to make sure that, we didn't touch on it today, but the leasing softwares, a lot of them also work for GASB 96. So you want to utilize that to do the discounting of present value. Really, I think about it like if you're climbing Mount Everest, go with the Sherpa, right? So you want to go with someone that's been there before and that has done it before. So don't be afraid to co-source and to use the line that has been laid by other people by reading these thousands of SBITAs. I assure you that many of your governmental peers are, especially those with vacancies. They're able to explain to governance like, hey, we have these open positions. We need to implement these new standards. Can we utilize this to co-source? And most governments have been pretty agreeable to that approach, and we'd be happy to assist with that. Lastly, how do you plan to implement GASB 96? 100% internally, co-sourcing with a software vendor, co-sourcing with a professional services firm. Haven't thought about it. Close eyes and hope it goes away. And while we're on that, what I'll go ahead and do is I'll move to our last slide while we're waiting for the results. Those are the QR codes where you connect with Scott and I. We love to discuss GASB 96. Be happy to address your specific situations further. There's our email addresses as well. You can find us on LinkedIn. Looking at the questions, Scott, I also want to be mindful of people's time. Let's see. What about if you have no plans to terminate? You want to think at some point, if you get to 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you're going to get to a point where you can't say you're reasonably certain not to terminate, at least for the technological advances piece, right? So there's going to be a line that you're going to be able to draw, even for those that you're going to say, I'm going to keep forever. Another question says, piggybacking off a state contract, do we use the term of the contract of the original agency? What you want to look at is, what are you agreeing to? Scott said, whenever you agree to this, you're in essence agreeing to their terms and conditions. So you'll want to go to one, look at what those terms and conditions are, but then also see if based off of your invoice, if that is the period that you're agreeing to, or if you're agreeing to some other, maybe shorter period than the large blanket agreement. One more second. No, we're a little bit over, just waiting to get the results.
Really fast, I'm noticing a lot of anonymous attendees ask questions. If you want to send us your questions through our email, we will get back to everybody who sends us a question, but we can't do it if all we have is an anonymous attendee.
Best of luck to the 38% of you that are doing it 100% internally. We'd be happy to be a resource to bounce off of. Those of you all that are working with a professional services firm, hopefully those of you are our advisory clients that attended. We appreciate you all that attended. And those 7% that close their eyes and hope it goes away, when you open your eyes, please reach out to us and we are happy to help. Thank you again so much for attending part 2. Make sure you check out part 1 that is on YouTube. Get us to those 2,000 views so we can turn that nickel from YouTube into a dime. And we're here and happy to help. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.